The dust had become a part of her. It lived in the worn seams of her gray dress, in the fine lines around her eyes, and coated her tongue with the taste of every mile she had walked. 40 miles. She had counted them by suns and sorrows, by the wearing thin of her husband's last good pair of boots on her feet, until the soles were little more than suggestions of leather. The ranch was supposed to be here, a place called the Bar T, a name she'd overheard in a dry goods store, spoken with the kind of reverence men usually saved for God or gold. A place, the men had said, run by Silas Thorne, a man who needed hands. Alara didn't know if she had hands left to offer. They were raw from washing other people's clothes in harsh lye soap, chapped from a wind that never seemed to stop blowing across the plains. But they were all she had, besides the small bundle tied with twine that held her last few possessions, and the knowledge her mother had passed down to her, a knowledge that felt as useless as a song in a dust storm. She crested a low rise, the prairie grass whispering dry secrets around her ankles, and saw it. It wasn't just a ranch, it was a kingdom carved out of the unforgiving land. A sprawling main house of dark, sturdy timber, barns bigger than any church she'd ever seen, and fences that ran straight and true until they vanished into the curve of the earth. A dog barked, a deep, rumbling sound that carried a warning. Men stopped what they were doing, turning to stare at the lone figure of a woman appearing out of the heat shimmer. They saw the exhaustion, the poverty in the faded cloth of her dress. They saw a problem, not a person. She straightened her spine, a small act of defiance against the ache in her bones. She had not walked 40 miles to be turned away by a stare. A man detached himself from a group near the corral. He was broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of authority. This was not Silas Thorne. This was a man who worked for him, a foreman perhaps, whose job was to keep trouble at a distance. "This is private property, missus," he said, his voice as gritty as the ground beneath her feet. He stopped a few paces from her, his hands resting on his hips. "You lost?" "No," she said, her own voice raspy from thirst and disuse. She cleared her throat. "I'm looking for work. I heard Mr. Thorne was hiring." The foreman's eyes swept over her, taking in the slender frame, the worn-out boots, the visible fatigue. He almost smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no humor. "We're hiring ranch hands, men who can rope and ride. You don't look the part." "I can cook. I can clean, mend, do laundry. Anything." Her gaze flickered past him toward the main house. It was a fortress, solid and silent. "I'm a hard worker." "The cookhouse is full and the housekeeper doesn't like help," he said, his tone final. It was the dismissal she had expected, the one she had heard in a dozen other places. But this was the last place. There was nowhere else to go. The prairie behind her was an empty slate. Before she could find the words to plead, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as a winter morning. "What is it, Jeb?" The foreman, Jeb, turned. The man who approached was taller, leaner, and moved with a stillness that was more commanding than any swagger. The sun caught the silver at his temples. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, carved by sun and something deeper. Something that looked like loss. This was Silas Thorne. He didn't look at her. He looked at his foreman, expecting an answer. "Woman looking for work, Mr. Thorne," Jeb said. "Told her we got nothing." Silas Thorne's eyes finally fell on her. They were gray, the color of a storm-tossed sky, and they held no warmth at all. He saw what Jeb had seen, but his gaze was sharper, more dissecting. He saw the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. He saw the blistered skin on her heels where the ruined boots had rubbed her raw. His gaze was an intrusion, and she felt a flare of anger that gave her strength. She met his stare and did not look away. "I am not asking for charity. Alara said, the words clear and steady despite the tremor in her body. I am asking for a wage. I will earn it. His jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having his world run in an orderly fashion. She was a disruption, a piece of tumbleweed blown against his fence. The rational thing was to send her on her way. Give her water and a piece of bread and point her toward the town, which was another 20 miles distant. He opened his mouth to do just that, but the front door of the big house opened. A little girl, no older than 6, slipped out onto the porch. She was a miniature version of him, with the same serious gray eyes and dark hair, but her face was pale, her frame delicate as a bird's. She clutched a worn corn husk doll and watched the scene with a solemn, silent intensity. Her gaze fell on Alara, and for a moment, the child's expression softened with a flicker of childish curiosity, unburdened by the judgment of the men. Silas saw his daughter, Lily, and something in his hard expression shifted. It was not a softening, but a subtle change in the tension around his mouth. He looked back at Alara, then at the vast empty land she had just crossed. He had built this entire world to keep his daughter safe, to wall off the dangers that had already taken so much from him. This woman was a stranger, an unknown quantity, and yet, the laundry shed needs a new roof, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. And the woodpile for the cookhouse is low. Jeb will show you where to sleep. You'll work for your keep until I decide if you're worth a wage. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving the foreman staring after him in disbelief. He had not offered her kindness, only a reprieve. For Alara, who had nothing, it was everything. She watched him go, a powerful man who moved like he was carrying a weight no one else could see, and felt the first, strange flutter of something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but a disquieting mix of both. The place Jeb showed her was not a room, but a small, windowless space at the back of the tack room, smelling of leather and horse sweat and dust. There was a cot with a thin, lumpy mattress and a single wool blanket that smelled of mothballs. It was more than she'd had in weeks. She sank onto the cot, the strength that had carried her 40 miles finally deserting her. She untied her bundle, laying out her few possessions, a change of underthings, a small, worn Bible, and a leather pouch filled with dried leaves and roots. She clutched the pouch. It was her mother's legacy, a collection of whispers about yarrow and willow bark, plantain and comfrey. The medicine of the earth, a medicine that had no value in a world that trusted black-coated doctors with their bitter powders and gleaming saws. The next day, she began to work. She stacked firewood until her arms screamed with the effort. She hauled buckets of water from the well, her palms blistering. She did not complain. She worked from before the sun rose until long after it set, moving with a quiet determination that the ranch hands, at first suspicious, began to grudgingly respect. She ate her meals alone, at the edge of the long table in the cookhouse, feeling the weight of their stares. She was an outsider, a ghost at their feast. Silas Thorne ignored her. He would ride past her, his face set like stone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But she knew he was watching. She could feel his eyes on her back as she worked, a silent, constant assessment. She learned about him in pieces, from snippets of conversation she overheard. She learned his wife had died giving birth to Lily. She learned he had built this ranch from nothing, clawing it out of the wilderness with his bare hands after the war. He was a man made of iron and will, respected by all, loved by none, except perhaps the small, silent girl who shadowed his steps. It was Lily who first breached the wall of silence. The child would appear while Alara was working, watching her with those big, solemn eyes. One afternoon, as Alara was sitting on the back step of the cookhouse, trying to stitch a patch onto her worn dress, Lily approached. She held out her corn husk doll. Its yarn hair had come undone. "Can you fix her?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Alara looked at the child's earnest face. She took the doll gently. "I think so," she said. With nimble fingers, she rebraided the yarn and tied it securely with a bit of thread from her own mending kit. She handed it back. Lily looked at the doll, then up at Alara, and a small, rare smile touched her lips. From then on, the child was her silent companion. She would bring Alara pretty rocks she'd found, or a feather from a bluebird's wing. They were small offerings, tiny gestures of acceptance in a world that offered none. Silas watched these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable, but he did not intervene. The proving came a month after her arrival. A young ranch hand named Billy, reckless and full of bravado, was gored by a steer during a branding. The horn tore a deep, ugly gash in his thigh. The men carried him to his bunk, a trail of blood marking the path. Silas sent for Dr. Finch from the town, 20 miles away. The doctor arrived in a cloud of dust and self-importance. He was a portly man with a florid face and hands that seemed too soft for the work he did. He stitched the wound crudely, pouring whiskey into it as the boy screamed. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and bed rest, collected his fee from a grim-faced Silas, and left with a pronouncement that the boy would be fine. He was not fine. By the next evening, a fever had set in. The wound was red and swollen, leaking a foul-smelling fluid. Billy was delirious, muttering and thrashing in his bunk. The men watched, helpless and grim. They had seen this before. They knew what blood poisoning looked like. Dr. Finch was summoned again. He returned, looked at the wound, and shook his head. "The infection has taken hold," he declared, his voice full of professional gravity. "There is nothing more I can do. Keep him comfortable. Pray." Alara had been watching from the doorway of the bunkhouse. She had seen the angry red streaks creeping up Billy's leg. She had smelled the sickness on the air. She heard the doctor's words, a death sentence delivered with a shrug. And something inside her, something she had kept buried for a long time, refused to accept it. She slipped away from the bunkhouse as the men stood in a somber cluster around Silas. She walked out from the ranch yard, her eyes scanning the ground. She knew what she was looking for. Her mother's voice was a whisper in her ear. She found it growing in a patch of sun-drenched earth near the creek bed. The broad, ribbed leaves of plantain. She gathered them, her hands sure and steady. Further on, she found yarrow, its feathery leaves and white flower clusters unmistakable. The fever flower, her mother had called it. She returned to the cookhouse, which was empty now. She washed the leaves and mashed them into a green, fragrant pulp in a clean bowl. She boiled water and steeped the yarrow into a bitter, potent tea. With her preparations in hand, she walked back to the bunkhouse. Silas was standing just outside the door, staring into the twilight, his shoulders slumped with the weight of responsibility for the boy who was dying under his roof. He turned as she approached, his face a mask of cold fury and despair. "What do you want?" he snapped. "Let me help him," she said simply. She held out the bowl with the poultice. "This will draw out the poison. The tea will break the fever." He stared at her as if she were mad. "You? With a handful of weeds? A doctor has already said it's hopeless." "That doctor is a fool," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a certainty that startled him. "He cleaned the wound with whiskey, which seared the flesh and trapped the sickness inside. He did not clean it. He sealed its fate." Jeb the foreman came to the door. "Mr. Thorne? What is she talking about?" "She thinks she's a doctor," Silas said, his voice dripping with scorn. "The earth is a doctor," Alara countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "If you know how to listen. That boy is dying. Your doctor has given up on him. What harm can I do now?" Her logic was a cold, hard thing. It cut through his pride and his skepticism. He looked from her earnest face to the dark doorway of the bunkhouse, where he could hear Billy's ragged, shallow breathing. He was responsible. He had seen too much death to accept it passively. He gave a sharp, bitter nod. Do what you can. But if he is worse for it, you will answer to me. She entered the sweltering bunkhouse. The men parted to let her through, their faces a mixture of doubt and desperate hope. She gently cleaned the wound, not with alcohol, but with clean boiled water. Then she packed the green poultice of crushed plantain leaves into the gash, covering it with a clean strip of cotton. The boy barely stirred. She lifted his head and patiently, a spoonful at a time, got him to swallow some of the bitter yarrow tea. She sat with him all night. She changed the poultice every few hours, and each time it came away dark with the poison it had drawn. She coaxed more tea into him. Silas stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her. He watched the gentle way she touched the boy's forehead, the focused intensity of her work, the utter lack of fear or hesitation in her movements. He was watching a competence so profound it was like an art form. It unsettled him. It made him feel something he had not felt in years, a flicker of hope in the face of the inevitable. Just before dawn, the fever broke. Billy's skin, which had been burning hot, was suddenly slick with sweat. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. He fell into a true, healing sleep for the first time in 2 days. When Alara emerged from the bunkhouse, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear, Silas was still there, leaning against the doorframe, a tin cup of coffee in his hands. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes held something other than cold assessment. It was a grudging, astonished respect. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence was full of meaning. She had done what the doctor could not. She had brought medicine that worked. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred on the bar tea. The ranch hands started calling her Mrs. Alara, their voices holding a new tone. They would bring her their small injuries, a rope burn, a cut, a pulled muscle, and she would treat them with her herbs and her quiet skill. She started a small garden behind the cookhouse, planting the seeds of healing herbs she had carefully carried with her. It was her own small patch of earth, a place of belonging. Silas gave her a room in the main house, a small, simple chamber meant for a governess they'd never hired. It had a window that looked out over the rolling hills. He started paying her a wage, leaving the coins on her dresser every Saturday without a word. Their interactions remained brief and formal, but the space between them was charged with an unspoken awareness. He would find excuses to be where she was, to watch her tending her garden, her hands moving deftly among the green leaves. He saw a gentleness in her that he had forgotten existed, a strength that was the opposite of his own harsh, brittle power. He found himself talking to her. It started small. He asked her the name of a plant. She told him, and also what it was for. He began to tell her about the ranch, about the struggles with drought and cattle prices. He spoke to her not as a boss to a servant, but as one solitary person to another. He never spoke of his wife, or of the grief that was a constant, invisible presence in the house. But in the evenings he would sometimes sit on the porch while she did, the two of them in rocking chairs, separated by a few feet of wooden planks that felt as wide as a canyon. They would watch the sunset, the sky bleeding orange and purple, and the silence between them was a conversation all its own. Lily, who had been a quiet and withdrawn child, began to blossom under Alara's gentle care. Alara taught her the names of the flowers and the herbs, weaving daisy chains for her hair and telling her stories her own mother had told her. Laughter, a sound that had been absent from the big house for years, began to be heard again, light and clear as a bell. Silas would hear it from his office, and his pen would still on the page. The sound pierced him, a sweet agony of what he had lost and what was, impossibly, beginning to grow in the cracks of his broken life. One evening he came upon her in the kitchen, long after the cook had gone to bed. She was grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle, the soft, rhythmic sound filling the quiet room. A single candle flickered on the table, casting her face in warm, moving shadows. She looked up as he entered, her hands stilling. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice soft. He walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, bringing one to her. His fingers brushed against hers as he handed her the cup, a brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt through them both. They both pulled back, as if burned. He cleared his throat and leaned against the counter, creating distance between them. "You've been good for Lily," he said, the words sounding stiff and inadequate. "She's a wonderful child," Alara replied, her eyes on her cup. "She just needed someone to see her." He knew she was talking about more than just the girl. She had seen him too. She had seen the damage he carried, the walls he had built, and she had not run. She had stayed and planted a garden. The thought terrified him. To need someone was to be weak, to risk a wound that would never heal. He had learned that lesson once, and it had nearly destroyed him. "The men respect you," he said, changing the subject. "Even Jeb." She allowed a small smile. "I think they were just relieved I didn't poison Billy." The air was thick with things they could not say. He wanted to ask her where she came from, what sorrows had etched those lines on her face, what had driven her to walk 40 miles to his door. But he couldn't. To ask would be to invite her into the locked rooms of his own past, and he had lost the key long ago. He finished his coffee in silence and left her there in the candlelight, the scent of crushed chamomile and an unspoken longing lingering in the air. The slow burn of their connection was tested when autumn arrived, bringing with it a cold, damp wind. It started with the ranch hands, a cough here, a fever there. Then it spread to the town. It was a lung sickness, one that settled deep and held on tight. Dr. Finch was busy, riding his buggy from one sickbed to another, dispensing useless tonics and grim prognoses. And then it came for Lily. It began as a small cough, a simple childhood ailment. But Alara heard the dry, tight sound of it, and a cold dread washed over her. Within a day, the fever began. Silas became a ghost, pacing the halls, his face a mask of controlled panic. This was how it had started with his wife, Sarah. A cough, a fever, and then a rapid decline that no one could stop. The memory was a raw, living thing inside him, and it was happening all over again. He sent for Dr. Finch immediately. The doctor arrived, examined Lily, and prescribed the same useless syrups he always did. "It's the seasonal affliction," he said pompously. "She's delicate. We must keep her warm and wait for it to pass." But it didn't pass. The fever climbed. Lily grew weak, her breathing becoming a shallow, rasping struggle. Alara watched, her heart aching for the child and for the man who was being torn apart by his own helplessness. She prepared teas of mullein and horehound to soothe the girl's lungs, but she did not dare administer them without his permission. The memory of his initial scorn over Billy's treatment kept her at a distance. This was his daughter, his grief, his choice. One night, the crisis came to a head. Lily was delirious, her small body burning with fever. Dr. Finch had been and gone, shaking his head and muttering about the will of God. Silas sat by his daughter's bed, a statue of despair. He had not eaten or slept in 2 days. He looked up and saw Alara standing in the doorway, her face etched with concern. In her hands, she held a steaming mug. "You need to keep your strength up," she said softly, placing the mug on the bedside table. He didn't look at it. He just stared at his daughter's flushed face. "He said there's nothing more to be done," he whispered, his voice broken. Just like with Sarah, the same words. Alara's heart broke for him. She reached out, a hesitant, instinctive gesture, and placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact, a lifetime of guardedness making him recoil. But then, as her warmth seeped through the fabric of his shirt, something in him gave way. He sagged, leaning into the touch for a fraction of a second, a silent admission of a burden too heavy to carry alone. It was the first time she had seen the iron will crack, revealing the wounded man beneath. He pulled away, straightening up, the mask of control snapping back into place. But the moment had happened. The wall between them had been breached. He looked at her, his eyes full of a desperate, terrifying plea. "Help her," he said. It was not a command, it was a prayer. But before she could act, Dr. Finch chose that moment to make his move. He had heard the whispers from the bar tea, the stories of the widow who had saved the Gord Ranch hand. His pride was stung, his authority questioned. He saw Ilara not as a healer, but as a threat. He began to talk in town, planting seeds of fear and suspicion. He spoke of folk magic, of dangerous, ungodly practices. He hinted that her cures were nothing more than luck, or worse, something dark. The next day, the sheriff arrived at the ranch with Dr. Finch at his side. The doctor's face was a smug mask of righteousness. "Silas," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. "Dr. Finch has lodged a complaint. He says this woman you have here is practicing medicine without a license, that she's a danger." Silas stared at the two men, his face hard as granite. He looked from the doctor's triumphant sneer to the sheriff's uneasy expression. He knew what this was. It was a challenge to his authority on his own land. It was an attempt to strip him of the one sliver of hope he had. "This woman," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous, "saved one of my men when this doctor left him to die. Now my daughter is sick, and he has failed her too." "It's God's will," Finch blustered. "You can't interfere with these backwoods potions. It's witchcraft, I tell you. She could kill the child." The word kill hung in the air. It struck Silas like a physical blow. The fear for Lily, raw and overwhelming, warred with the nascent trust he had in Ilara. He was a man of logic, of order. The doctor represented the established world. Ilara represented something unknown, something wild. In a moment of pure, gut-wrenching terror, he faltered. He looked at Ilara, who had come to the porch, and his face was a torment of indecision. "Stay away from my daughter," he said, the words torn from him, "until the sheriff has sorted this out." The look on Ilara's face was not one of anger, but of profound, shattering hurt. He had chosen fear over faith. He had chosen the man who had failed him over the woman who had not. The connection that had been so slowly, carefully built between them crumbled into dust. She turned without a word and walked back into the house. The light went out of her eyes. The crisis had come. She went to her small room and packed her meager belongings into her bundle. Her garden, her place at the table, the fragile sense of home she had begun to feel. It had all been an illusion. She was what she had always been, an outsider, a wanderer. She would not stay where she was not trusted. She would not watch a child die because a man was too proud and too afraid to believe in what he had seen with his own eyes. She would leave at dawn. The 40 miles she had walked to get here felt like nothing compared to the journey she would have to make now, with a broken heart as her only companion. That night was the longest of Silas Thorne's life. He sat by Lily's bed, listening to the labored sound of her breathing, each rasp a knife in his heart. The sheriff was gone, promising to return. Dr. Finch was gone, his poison sown. Silas was alone with his dying child and his catastrophic choice. He looked at Lily's face, so pale against the pillow, and saw Sarah. He was failing again. The world he had built, this fortress of wood and land, was useless against the enemy he could not fight. He had chosen the path of safety, of convention, and it was leading him straight back to the same black abyss of grief that had swallowed him years ago. He thought of Ilara. He saw her hands, so sure and gentle on Billy's wound. He heard her voice, quiet and certain, telling him the earth was a doctor. He remembered the feel of her hand on his shoulder, a small anchor in a raging storm. He had pushed that anchor away. The breaking point came near midnight. Lily's breathing hitched, then stopped. For a terrifying second there was only silence, then a small, strangled gasp. It was the sound of a life slipping away. In that moment, Silas Thorne's pride, his fear, his rigid control, it all shattered. He knew with a certainty that shook him to his soul that he had made a terrible mistake. He ran. He burst out of Lily's room and down the hall to the small chamber where Alara slept. He didn't knock. He threw the door open. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in the moonlight, her small bundle at her feet. She looked up at him, her eyes shadowed with sorrow. "She's worse," he choked out, the words raw. "I was wrong. I was a fool." He stopped in front of her, the great Silas Thorne, the master of the bar tea, and he was brought to his knees not by an enemy or a disaster, but by his own heart. "Please," he said, his voice breaking completely. "Don't leave. Help her. I'm begging you." This was his revelation. In front of no one but the woman he had wronged, he shed the armor he had worn for years. He was vulnerable, broken, and admitting his need. He was pleading. Alara looked at his face, ravaged by fear and regret, and the hurt in her own heart was eclipsed by a wave of compassion. This was not about pride or being proven right. This was about a little girl's life and a man's soul. She stood up, her bundle forgotten on the floor. "Get me fresh water, boiled," she commanded, her voice suddenly crisp and full of authority. "And build up the fire in the stove. I'll need to make a steam." His rescue of her from leaving was met by her rescue of his hope. He didn't hesitate. He ran to do her bidding, a powerful man taking orders from a penniless widow, because in that moment she was the only authority that mattered. She went to work. This was her proving ground, her final test. She gathered her herbs, her hands moving with practiced speed. She made a powerful tea of elecampane root to clear the lungs. She crushed thyme and eucalyptus leaves, pouring boiling water over them in a basin to create an aromatic steam. Silas returned, and together they made a tent of a sheet over Lily's bed, trapping the healing vapors for the child to breathe. They worked side by side through the long, dark hours. He held the lamp while she measured drops of tincture. She showed him how to bathe Lily's forehead with cool water steeped in lavender. They did not speak of what had passed between them. They were united in a single desperate purpose. He watched her, no longer with skepticism, but with awe. She was a warrior fighting a battle he did not understand, using weapons of leaf and root, and knowledge passed down through generations. She was saving his daughter, and in doing so, she was saving him. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, the change they had been praying for finally came. Lily's breathing eased. The rasping sound was replaced by a deeper, clearer rhythm. The fever, which had raged like a wildfire, finally receded. She coughed, a deep, productive cough that cleared the sickness from her small chest. Then her eyes fluttered open. She looked at her father and then at Alara, and a tiny, sleepy smile touched her lips. Silas sank into the chair by the bed, the tension draining out of him so completely he felt he might collapse. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. It was the grief he had never allowed himself for his wife, the terror he had just endured for his daughter, all pouring out of him at once. Alara stood quietly, her hand resting on his back, letting him break, knowing he would be whole again when he was done. Later that morning, the sheriff returned, Dr. Finch trailing behind him like a vulture. They found Silas on the porch, holding a sleeping Lily wrapped in a blanket. The child was breathing easily, her color returned. Dr. Finch stopped short, his mouth falling open. How? Silas Thorne stood up, his face calm and his eyes as cold and clear as ice. He looked directly at the doctor. Mrs. Alara did what you could not, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable authority that all the men on his ranch knew and respected. She used her knowledge and her care, and she saved my daughter's life. Your services, doctor, are no longer required on this ranch, or in this territory, if I have anything to say about it. He then turned to the sheriff. There's no trouble here, Sheriff. Only a debt that can never be repaid. This woman is under my protection. If anyone in this town so much as speaks a word against her, they will answer to me. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the dust. He was choosing her, not just for her skill, but for who she was. He was choosing her over reputation, over convention, over the judgment of the entire community. The rescue was complete, and it was mutual. She had saved his child. He had saved her name. Together, they had saved each other. The seasons turned. Lily grew strong and healthy, her laughter a constant melody in the ranch house. Dr. Finch, his reputation in tatters, quietly packed his bags and moved on. The stories of the widow healer on the bar T became legend, spoken with respect and wonder. People from neighboring homesteads began to come to her, not to Silas, bringing their sick children and their injured hands, and she turned none away. One cool evening in late spring, Silas found her by her garden. It was flourishing, a riot of green and silver leaves, purple blossoms and yellow flowers. But next to it, where there had been only bare earth, two of his ranch hands were finishing the construction of a small building made of timber and glass, a greenhouse, a place to keep her precious plants safe through the harsh winter. It was a solid, permanent thing, a promise made of wood and nails. She turned as he approached, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He reached out and gently brushed it away. His touch lingered on her skin, and this time, neither of them pulled away. A man who has a healer on his ranch should make sure she has what she needs to do her work, he said, his voice quiet. You built this for me, she whispered, her eyes shining. I did, he said. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Alara, this ranch, it was just a place to work, a place to hide. You made it a home again. For Lily, and for me. He looked at her, his gray eyes, once so stormy and cold, now full of a warm, steady light. I need you to stay, not as a healer, not as a housekeeper, as my wife. She looked at the greenhouse, a testament to how he saw her and valued her. She looked at the big house, where a child's laughter echoed on the evening air. She looked at this man, this broken, powerful man who had learned to be vulnerable, to feel again. He had saved her from a life of wandering, and she had saved him from a life of loneliness. I walked 40 miles with nothing but holes in my shoes and a few dried herbs, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I'd find a place to stop walking. Stop here, he said, his grip on her hand tightening. With me. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that transformed her face. Yes, she said. Yes, Silas. I will. They stood there as the last rays of the sun painted the sky, their hands joined, the scent of herbs and damp earth rising around them. The frontier was still wild, the land still hard, but here, in this small kingdom built of timber and love, they had found their shelter. They had found their peace. The love that grows in the hardest soil is often the strongest, a truth that echoes in the quiet courage we find in our own lives. If their story of healing and hope has touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the heart of the frontier. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We're left to wonder, Have you ever trusted someone's quiet wisdom over the loud voice of authority? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We believe every heart, no matter how weathered, holds the capacity for a new spring.